Hardeep Matharu, editor of the Byline Times. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. So let's talk about herd immunity. You've recently written a piece about it, and I wondered, in your view, whether the government's initial strategy for dealing with the coronavirus was misplaced or perhaps even negligent.
Absolutely. I think we definitely need to have a conversation about the initial strategy that the government was following. Now, it's very keen to say at this moment that it's a distraction. If any journalists ask about the possibility that they were trying to create herd immunity as an approach to the coronavirus, Matt Hancock has said that's a distraction and that we now need to focus on prioritising lives. No one's disputing that the priority isn't to focus on saving lives and to support the NHS. But it is very, very important that we understand if any discussions were in place in the early days when we knew that the coronavirus was on its way, which could have distracted the government, Boris Johnson and those around him, from taking early interventionist measures, as many other countries across Europe were doing, and which we didn't, and whether that had an impact, that, the lost time had an impact on the fact that the UK is now on a trajectory to be recording the highest death rates from COVID-19 in all of Europe. So we definitely need to keep asking these questions. It's not a distraction, it's very justifiable scrutiny of government decisions. And herd immunity has never been at the centre of any strategy for a public health emergency in the absence of a vaccine. So it is very odd that the government and its own advisors were talking about this publicly and that it's now reluctant to talk about it at all. So I think that definitely does need to be questioned and scrutinized. Did it result in us losing time? I think that's very, very important. Questions have been raised about the types of advisors and expert advisors that the government has surrounded itself with and has been listening to. Do those people have practical frontline experience of the reality of a medical emergency like this? And, there are still questions that are being asked, I would say, about is the government going down a de facto herd immunity? So obviously we've had a lockdown imposed, which is very good, but there are still so many questions about the lack of personal protective equipment, the lack of widespread testing, contact tracing. I do think people are right to perhaps have questions about whether there is some sort of de facto herd immunity approach going on and that sort of thing. And again, I'm not talking about any kind of conspiracy or any sort of intention to have the UK have an unacceptable number of deaths. But I do think that we need to look at that nexus of decision-making, policy, behavioural science, expert advisors. And we need to remember that expert advisors also operate, or in this situation, they are operating within a political climate. They are being asked questions by politicians. Politicians will be the ones who make the decisions. They're given the options, but they make the decisions.
There is nothing like a lethal pandemic, is there, to sort of shock you out of a post-truth world, is there?
I still don't think that we're actually being told what is the basis of a lot of these decisions or a lot of this thinking. And I do think that those briefings don't shed much light at all. I do think it's a way for the government to show that it's communicating with the public, but I feel, and a lot of people have responded and said that they feel the same thing. They watch these briefings and they feel that it's a charade of half-truths, lies and spin. And the audience, we know that the truth is being dodged, or it's not clear answers are not being given. And actually, the people behind the podiums, the politicians and the advisors, know that we know that. And so we're in this very sort of odd situation where it's a constructed reality almost, which I've said that, we need to be on our guard against. We can't become comfortably numb to accepting things that are not normal, such as being on a trajectory to have the highest death rates in Europe. Before the lockdown was imposed, a lot of the language, and you saw it in Boris Johnson's sort of actually open reluctance to tell the British public that they must stay at home. He was saying, you shouldn't go to the pub and that sort of thing. His own father said that if he needed to go to a pub, he would go to a pub after he said this. Anyway, so what we did see was a very curious sort of notion that this would be really draconian. Imposing a lockdown on the British public would be seen as something that was unacceptable. People wouldn't want to do it. People wouldn't do it. They needed to be nudged in the right ways, in different ways. But, this notion that, the British public don't have to do it the way everyone else is doing it. We have Dunkirk spirit. The Brit is uniquely positioned to weather whichever storm comes its way. And we're not going to ask people to do this. And so that, I think, did feed into it. And again, I mean, is that scientific? Is that behavioural science? Is that just myth? Is that just legend? I mean, which is it? So, it is curious, all of these assumptions that were made. And even now, the way that the politicians speak to the public during these Downing Street briefings, I call it sort of a mixture of an apologetic and a headmasterly tone. It doesn't seem to be, despite the politicians saying that they want to level with the British public, it doesn't seem that they feel that the British public are an equal to them. They're sort of being patronised and sort of told certain things. And again, I do think that's really curious about the language that's being used and the assumptions that are being used, which are not just scientific or behavioural science. It's actually the myths that we've been telling ourselves as a country for many years now.
Trump, Johnson, Bolsonaro, Orban, Salvini, Modi, even, I think that should be President Xi. That should be a real concern, shouldn't it? That Gordon Brown likes to say, global problems need global solutions, but if that's the case, we don't really have a set of world leaders, particularly the most important, the largest, the strongest, who really have any interest or have expressed much of a position of international cooperation, and that could potentially be quite damaging, couldn't it?
Yeah, no, and I think you're right to point out that actually you see this across the world in terms of countries such as the US, what's happening in Brazil, India, these sort of where we have these strongman sort of populist leaders. It is this approach that, our country can go this way, and the leader knows best. And you see that a lot with what Trump has been doing. And there has been a lot of discussion around whether the coronavirus is a fundamental turning point. Does this change everything? Will our political and social landscape never be the same again? And I think it's very difficult to say at this moment in time. But it's not, you would think that a pandemic would strengthen those ties across the world, would make our politics, would make our politicians realise more strongly than ever of why it's important, working with other countries is very important, and why you do need global solutions to global problems. But I don't think that's a foregone conclusion at all.
So is it your view then that the experts have failed to speak truth to power to our political leaders in response to the coronavirus?
I think that political parties need to commit now to holding a public inquiry into the coronavirus after the crisis has eased. And I think that we need that inquiry to really uncover the truth about what happened. Now, I can't categorically say that the experts failed to speak truth to power, but I think questions need to be asked around which experts were consulted, whether they were scientific, whether there were individuals who had expertise in behavioural science, whether they were academic modelers, to the extent to which they had frontline medical experience of the reality. We need to understand eventually, and we should already be thinking about it, whether they are being influenced to give certain decisions, to give certain advice. But at the end of the day, politicians are the ones who are making the decisions. They're presented with the options, and then they will decide what to do. So I think ultimate responsibility lies there. So again, when you had 250,000 racegoers flocking to Cheltenham Festival on 10th to 13th of March, and we've all seen those images in the press, thousands and thousands of people, at a time when we absolutely knew that the coronavirus was going to accelerate in the UK. Why was that happening? You know, where were the public health community and the experts that perhaps didn't speak up about that? But more importantly, why did they feel they couldn't? If that was the case, why did they feel that they couldn't? So I definitely think it's a mixture of all these things, and we really need to look at that. But speaking truth to power, I would say, has never been more important than now. And we've got to get to the bottom of whether that actually happened or not, but not forget that it's the politicians who've been making the decisions, and ultimate responsibility lies with them.
Hardeep, Matharu, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.